basically, in a nutshell, I was raised generations deep in a family of faith. To be honest with you, for sure on my dad's side of the family, in a direct line going back as far as I can trace, I don't know of any unbelievers. I don't know of anyone who was not a believer in God. And so, what happened to me early on, I don't even remember how young. I was probably 10, 12 years old when I started consciously thinking about this, because especially in the community that I was raised in, I was, I got to think, fourth generation of my family to live in that community, 100 years. And so I grew up in an environment where I was repeatedly hearing the stories of my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, my uncles, and all the amazing things that they'd done, the ways they'd helped people. I can only put it like this. I never ran into somebody that said, I can't stand your family, I can't, it's more like when I was a kid working on somebody's lawn. I remember talking to a guy, and he heard my name, and he says, are you related to Alpheus? And I said, yeah, that was my great-grandfather. And he said, I want to shake your hand. That was the most godly man I ever knew. So I grew up hearing these things. Now, the way that I processed that was, that is really cool. That's awesome. People still remember the things that my family has done 60 years after the fact. And I thought, I want people to talk about me that way someday. That would be really slick. And so I decided that people were going to talk about me that way someday. Now, that sounds great maybe at first glance, but I didn't decide I was going to serve God with all my heart, soul, strength, and mind. I decided that I wanted that reputation. And so I went to work on it. And somewhere along the way, I acquired a knack for fixing things and generally being kind of handy to have around. And in the process, had a lot of the right lingo to go with it and a lot of the, proper Christian vernacular. And so by the time I was probably 22, 23, right in there, I had successfully traversed my teenage years without going off on some wild, rebellious bender. I didn't party, I didn't smoke, I didn't drink, and I was preaching on a pretty regular basis, and people actually, unless they were lying to me, mic trouble. There we go. Unless they were lying to me, they actually liked what I had to share. I could show you if I had my notebook with me. I had all these nicely laid out sermons with all the proper points in them. Gorgeous things compared to the sermon notes I create now. But anyhow, and I actually had people coming up to me saying just the thing that I had hoped they'd say someday, and it was, I hope my kids turn out like you. We've made it. But guess what? If you get what you thought you wanted when you're about 23 years old, then what's left to acquire? And right about at that point in my life was when I had a really narrow scrape with death. I won't go into all the details, but there's a few people here that can remember back. Jim Clark came and visited me in the hospital, and Dean here, who's visiting today, came and visited me, and they definitely could attest the fact I about died. Now, when I was in that hospital, I was busy thinking to myself, realizing that I had shoved God himself into the back corner of my life, that was a bad idea. All of a sudden, when I'm dying and I'm realizing that I might need to know him a little better, that conversation we'd had a couple weeks before where I'd said, I'm kind of busy right now, I'll get with you in a few months, might not have been the best idea. But after that, I said, very much like the Israelites. Remember, they went in, told to go into the promised land. They said, nope, we won't go. And then God said, all right, I'm dragging your butts out in the wilderness, and you're going to rot out there for 40 years. They said, oh, we'll go after all. Tried to march in. Well, very similar experience. I lay on my back and thought, all right, I'm listening now, God. And I got 4 years of the wilderness. I'm thankful that God pared it down, divided by 10. But I had 4 years where I couldn't seem to get through. Man, this thing and I are not getting along today. To heaven, it's hard to describe, but where I just felt like I was going in circles, guys. 3 years ago, when I say 3 years ago, this is a short rabbit trail. I'm not a superstitious person, but it is interesting to me that God tends to work, at least in my life, in somewhat predictable cycles. This time of year, when I say this time, I mean literally 3 years ago. It could be to the day. I haven't been keeping track of this, but it was in August, about this time of month of August, 3 years ago, when I finally got slowed down enough to think. And I was riding along, and I was actually running a blueberry harvester, and I was running that thing, cruising along 1.5 miles an hour with nothing to do but think. And I'm convinced now, had a few thoughts dropped into my head because I wasn't in the habit of thinking about this stuff this way. But I remember the whole progression, but the one that stands out was this thought that popped into my head as I was feeling pretty gnawing, aching, empty, not that well inside. And I thought about one thought, and it was this: if I could give anyone else exactly what I've got, would I want them to have it? And then there was this silence. I'm sitting there thinking about that, and I had to say no. Now, I had all of the proper stuff. I had a church that I could invite anybody into and say, here, have a spot. And I realized, okay, let's say I take them into my church. I set them in a pew. Let's say that I move over one spot from where I normally sit and say, okay, you sit in my spot. You take all of my beliefs, all of my actions, embrace that, and get the same results I'm getting. Would I want them to have that? And the reason I said no was because I was miserable. And I thought, I wouldn't do that to my worst enemy. And as I thought about that, I thought, if what I've got isn't worth giving away, then for goodness sakes, why do I want to keep it? And so, talk about crisis. I'm staring here looking, and wait a minute, everything I've built so carefully for 26 years isn't worth keeping? But I'm serving God. How can this be possible? And right then and there, I said, enough. I am not going to live this way anymore. I won't. I got on my knees. I literally shut my machine down, and with tears pouring down my face, said, God, if this is all there is to faith, I'm done. I think this mic has it in for me today. All right.
How's that feel?
Feels good. Thank you. So, I looked at my life, and I just said, God, if this is all there is to faith, I'm done. This is a waste of my time. I don't want any more. Now, mind you, everything I'd been doing had been based on building up this image of righteousness, what I perceived as a godly man. I looked at all the people around me, thought, I like that about that person, and that about that person, and that about that person. And my deciding factor in whether I was doing what I ought to be doing or not was based on, well, do I look like that guy and that guy and that guy? And I'm kind of in the middle, so we're cool. But when I realized that that wasn't good enough, I prayed and I said, God, what I've got isn't the real thing. Because another thought that was running through my head then, I had come to mind the list, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, etc. You know all that. It says, this is the fruit of the Spirit. And I was looking at my life as if I was standing back looking at it, and I thought, I don't see any of that stuff happening on the inside. People might see stuff that looks like that on the outside, but I sure ain't feeling any of that on the inside. And I realized to go on this way, to look at God and say, I'm serving you, and yet I don't experience any of that stuff, was to look God in the face and say, you lied. when you said the fruit of the Spirit is, and then I'm not experiencing any of that, somehow that implied God must have lied, because what I was in effect saying is I'm doing it all and I'm not getting the results you said I'd get. So I realized that was completely illogical. The only possible explanation for not getting the results God said you would get if you do what he said to do is you must not be doing what he told you to do. I mean, this is all crashing out. It was literally like half an hour. My entire belief system crumbled. So I'm left with now what? I only had one option. I got on my knees and I said, God, I want the real thing, and I do not care what it costs. I don't care about my image anymore. I don't care about my occupation. I don't care about anything. If you tell me, literally prayed this, to go run down the middle of the street in pink underwear, I will do it. But one condition, I have to know it's you talking. And I meant it. I meant it. I was just like, I don't care. Now, reason I had to pray that radical was because, like I say, image was very important to me. And that was the first thing that popped to mind as the most Andy ain't doing that thought. I'm thinking, if there's one thing I would not do, that was it. So, all right. So I prayed that prayer and I meant it. And then God said, stand up in front of your church and go tell them you're going to find me. And then I found something I wanted to do even less than run down the middle of the street in pink underwear. I'm thinking, no, that's too far. That can't be God saying that. That was the first thought. I have this whole logical explanation. I've been preaching there for 2 years, and that wouldn't be good for those people because, they've heard all these messages I've shared, and for me to stand up and say I'm going to go find God might cause them conflicts of faith because they've seen me portraying this, and no, that can't be God. What else would you like me to do, God? Silence. And after about half an hour of that, I thought, this is stupid. I just told him I'd do anything. And then the next thought popped to mind, and that's this. What I've got isn't worth keeping. This is not real. What I have is this deep. And if God's not real, then why do I care what any of these people think? Because my perception of what they think of me only matters if God is real. So if God's not real, I could stand up in front of that group and say everything and have them go, what a screwball, and tell me to get out of church. And who cares? But if God is real, maybe I should care more about what he thinks than what they think. So I said, all right, I'll do it. This was on a Monday, so I was pretty jittery, and I know myself that I've made all kinds of resolutions and resolved that I was going to do this or that in the past. So I thought, all right, this is going to take a little stick to it. So I called up one of the elders of my church on the phone, and I said, hey, I got something I want to say next week. Can I have a couple minutes? He said, sure, what do you want to say? I went, oh, darn. I'm not quite sure yet, but I think it's got something to do with needing to go follow God. And I didn't know what the response to that would be, but I was pretty sure it was going to be, you're going to do what? Instead, he says, God's been talking to me. I think that might be part of it. Yeah, you go ahead and do that. I'm like, oh, man, this gets nuttier all the time. So that whole week, I was busy getting work done. I won't go into all the details, but it was just hammer time. Junk getting knocked out of my life. And yes, that following weekend, I stood in front of my church and said, I'm going to go follow God. Do any of you want to come along? Everybody looked at me like, anybody? No, it was interesting. A few people came up afterwards and asked me questions about, what's going on with you? This seems a little off. And a few people that were kind of like, sounds interesting, we'll watch. But I didn't have anybody run up to me and give me a big hug and go, wow, that sounds awesome, can we come too? All right. Now, what happened then over the next year was I was studying, digging in, and one of the things that I had prayed during that week when God was working on me, and he was showing me all the ways that my belief system didn't work, it just came to me in the last couple of weeks when I'd been asked to come speak here. I don't even know if I've told Kelvin this. It's so bizarre because I'd forgot all about it. One of the things that I asked God was, now, mind you, I believed in my belief system, my theology, everything I was doing, I believed in it. as much as I was capable of it with my head, okay? And even though my belief system, in some ways visually, looked a lot different than yours, I would have looked at your belief system and my belief system, and I'd have gone, yep, they're all Christians, and yep, they're all saved, and someday they'll get it right and they'll look like me. But that didn't seem to be happening. And that's what hit me that week, is I thought, why is it that if I'm so right, people don't seem to be able to hear outside of my little corner and sect of friends that I was so convinced we had it right? Outside of that narrow little circle, how come I can't share? And I literally, with tears pouring down my face, said, God, I see church all across America crumbling. I see morality leaving my country. And I can do nothing about it. And I asked God, I said, God, why can't I go into any church in America and have a message to share with them? And I asked him, God, give me a message for the rest of your people. I thought what was going to happen was he was going to give me a message, a way to communicate what I already believed. I thought that's what the results of that prayer would be, that he'd take and somehow package my theological system in a way that I could stand here in front of Georgetown Christian Fellowship and preach it to you. I didn't realize it was going to take 3 years of him dismantling my belief system and recreating it from the ground up. And so standing here today is really bizarre, because that prayer happened, I'm telling you, I wish I knew the date. It could be 3 years ago to the day that I was praying that, saying, God, give me a message for the rest of the body. And after 3 years of whooping and pounding, he said, all right, I think you're ready to try this thing. So I ended up working through a whole bunch of personal heart level stuff. And then 2 years ago, once again, this has happened always in August. In August, God got a hold of me 3 years ago. 2 years ago in August, I walked into this building for the first time. I'd heard about the Monday night group, and bizarre set of circumstances got me in here. I was convinced I was sent here, and I'm still convinced of that. Came in here and met this nutty guy, Kelvin, who definitely was way outside of my comfort zone. He's definitely not the kind of guy, I realize I'm letting the cat out of the bag, but not the kind of guy that you want to just, say, take to the beach with you if you want to just go have a quiet time on the beach and not interact. If you're just wanting to go sit in the sun and have your little bubble around you, do not take Kelvin to the beach with you. I liked my bubble. He popped it. So, I came in here with God having done a lot of work on me, but my bubble pretty well intact as far as comfort zone that way. And that first night in here with a lot of these guys, a couple of them in the front row, Dan, Michael, and there's others of you scattered here, that what God showed me that first night was when he really started tearing apart some of my theological belief system and recreating it. Because what he showed me so clearly, as these guys prayed for me, by the way, that's what happened the first night I came in here. I walked in and they gathered around and said, let's pray for him. Laid hands on me, prayed that I'd receive the Holy Spirit and get cleaned out and reamed out and all that jazz. And I bawled all the way home that night. And the next day, I bawled most of the day on top of the blueberry harvester and was repenting and going, God, I didn't know I had it so wrong. And I think it was about the second week that Kelvin was asking me more about where I'd come from. And, I was telling my background, which was raised Church of God Seventh Day. And we went through the Messianic movement and all this. If you hear, funny Hebrew words and stuff pop up here and there, it's from this journey that I've walked on. And I still value a lot of that stuff greatly, but it's not the core of my belief system anymore. And that's what God showed me. And Kelvin said something, I think it was about the second week I showed up to the Monday night gathering, and he said, Andy is getting delivered from his legalism. And at first, I got to admit, that kind of offended me a little bit. There was a part of me that was like, I don't need to be delivered from legalism. I'm already as delivered as I need to get, thank you kindly. But I realized over the next several weeks and months that he was right. But it wasn't that I was getting delivered from a particular belief system. It's that everyone needs to be delivered from any belief system that they hold up and say, God, this is what I am going to do for you. That's legalism. It's not some elaborate scheme of particular beliefs. It's any belief that you hold between you and God and say, this is what I am going to do for you as repayment or as an exchange for what you've given me. So, now it's time for me to get going with this message. So, that said, stones that live.